Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-empowerment. Future Squared brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you and your company stay relevant in an era of rapid change and 10x your results in both your professional and personal life. Each week, I'll bring you corporate innovators, entrepreneurs, authors, keynote speakers, and thought leaders such as Steve Blank, David Allen, Brad Feld, Tim Harford, Karen Dillon, Jenny Blake, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, Pascal Finette, Ryan Blair, and Ash Moria, to name just a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you Fast Fix Friday, some quick, digestible insights to help you end your week on a high as you head off for the weekend. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub, school and consultancy based in Melbourne, Australia and Singapore that works with companies to help them adopt the mindset, methods and tools to navigate change and survive and thrive in an era of rapid disruption. If your organization needs help coming up with ideas, testing and turning ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. Welcome back to Future Squared. Today I bring you Sam Walker. He's the Wall Street Journal's deputy editor for Enterprise, the unit that oversees the paper's in-depth, page-one features and investigative reporting projects. A former reporter, columnist, and sports editor, Walker founded the journal's prize-winning daily sports coverage in 2009. He's the author of Fantasyland, a best-selling account of his attempt to win America's top fantasy baseball expert competition, and also just released The Captain Class, the hidden force that creates the world's greatest teams, in which he profiled the greatest sports teams in history and identified the counterintuitive leadership qualities of the unconventional men and women who drove them to succeed. In it, he lets us in on a little secret. The secret to winning is not what you think it is. It's not the coach, it's not the star, it's not the money, it's not the strategy. It's something else entirely, he tells us. So in this episode, we'll find out what that is, in addition to the top 16 most successful sports teams in history and what they had in common, the top 7 core qualities behind an effective leader, and whether sports teams make a good reference point for startups and corporate innovation teams. So with that, I bring you the one and only Sam Walker. Welcome to the show, Sam.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, and you're joining us from the East Coast. I believe you're in New York at the moment?
That's right. I'm in Manhattan, and it's 10:30, and I'm caffeinated and chipper and ready to go.
Well, you're caffeinated. I'm sure you're caffeinated because you just returned from a book tour in London. You're in Italy, kicking your feet up for a little while, but your body clock is all over the shop. I think before we started recording, you said you feel like it's 4 a.m.
Yeah. No, I hope I don't get too punchy. If I do, just let me know.
It's all good. I thought I'd throw that disclaimer out there for our audience. So if they're like, Sam sounds a little bit off today, they'll know exactly why. So before we get into talking about your new book, Sam, you're a 2-time champion of America's top fantasy baseball competition. And I know some of our listeners might be playing fantasy footy or fantasy English Premier League here in Australia.
Right.
What's one big tip you'd give to anybody playing fantasy sports?
You have to use a blend of statistical know-how and your gut. I mean, you really have to take some risks and do some dramatic things. I mean, the times that I won, I noticed the difference was that I just had a lot more confidence in my impressions. And I had a couple of players that I picked up that I spent a lot of money on, during the season, and they really made the difference for me. And I think it's the ability to take risks and to and not foolish risks, obviously, but I think that when you really go at it in a serious way, and you look at the statistics and the numbers, I mean, I think you tend to get cautious and you tend to to be conservative in the way you play. And I think that's how a lot of us start. And I think when you really start to get good at it is when you are able to take those things into account, but also to take risks and to make the big moves.
That's a great point. And I guess I draw parallels between that and a lot of what we talk about on this show, which is all around entrepreneurship and innovation. And unless you're willing to take risks, you can only expect mediocrity. Whereas if you're picking all the safe players, the same players that everybody else is picking, then chances are you're going to finish somewhere around the middle, right?
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, the funny thing about all fantasy leagues are a little bit different, but when you're talking about fantasy baseball, the funny thing about it is there's nothing other than winning. And, you have to take this attitude that your goal has to be to win, and to win by a big margin. And I think if you take that approach to playing, and you accept a certain level of volatility and risk in the game, then you're more likely to win, and you're more likely to win big, and that's really the idea. And I think playing for second place or third place, it's really silly. I mean, it's fantasy sports. It's like just win or just be cleaned out. I mean, it seems like anything in the middle is useless.
Yeah, you haven't exactly got your life riding on it. And it's like that Jeff Bezos quote, if you swing for the fences, you're going to strike out a lot, but you're going to hit some home runs. Whereas if all you do is bunt to get to first base, then that's all you can ever expect.
Yes, and you got to win. But I mean, the biggest point of pride for me with that league was that I still own the biggest margin of victory in the history of the league. Oh, wow. And everything worked, and it wasn't brain power. It was there was a lot of luck involved, but I think that's the idea. And when you're doing something for fun like that, you really have to think, look, I want to win this by 20 points. I want to win this by a giant margin and play that way, and I think you'll be better off.
We'll make sure not to share your email in the show notes, otherwise you might get inundated with fantasy footy players. But as I mentioned earlier in the show, you've just released your new book, The Captain Class, and you were over in London promoting it recently. And the book explores the hidden force that creates the world's greatest teams. But before we get into the book, how did your journey to find out what freak teams have in common begin, Sam?
To go way back, it really started when I was 11, and I played on a baseball team here in the U.S. as a kid, and this team was always the same kids. It was a bunch of kids from my neighborhood. We played together every year. We were solidly mediocre. We won about half of our games every year, and not a spectacular team. But that one season,
is this like the Bad News Bears?
Yeah, well, no, we weren't that bad. I mean, I'd like to pretend that we were useless, but no, we were okay. We just weren't great. But this one season, I don't know what happened, but we didn't lose, and we went undefeated, and we won the city championship, and it was really amazing because none of us kind of understood what was going on, but you saw that as the team played together, everyone started to make better plays and to play kind of beyond their ability, and the team was so much better than the sum of its parts. And so it really started there. I always thought after that, hey, this is the normal course of things. I'll be on a lot of great teams, but that was it for me. I mean, I never was on another winning team in any level of sports, and that went all the way into recreational basketball and softball in my 20s. I just never experienced that again. So that was kind of the seeds of it. I was always fascinated by great teams, and I became a sports writer. And, I spent a lot of time around elite teams. I had this great job, at the Journal where I really just covered the big events. And I really got to see a lot of great teams up close. And, I always thought they were very similar. And I kind of thought that I had a sense of what great teams were all about. But it all changed in 2004 when I spent a lot of the baseball season with the Boston Red Sox. And the Red Sox, hadn't won at that point a World Series in 86 years. Yeah. I mean, they were the first franchise of American sports. And, this team did not seem to me to have any of the characteristics of a great team. They were kind of haphazard and undisciplined and not really entirely serious. And, they fell way behind in the standings in July, and they were kind of left for dead, and I wasn't surprised at all. But in August, I saw something happen, and they just started to play a different kind of game, and they had this swagger and confidence I hadn't seen. And, they went on to storm back into the postseason, and they beat the New York Yankees in the postseason. They won the World Series, and suddenly everyone's saying, this is one of the great baseball teams of the century. And, it was astounding to me. But what I realized at that point was that there was a kind of hole in my education about teams, and I'd seen a lot of elite teams, and I thought I knew what they were all about, but I'd never seen the moment they became great. I kind of caught up with them after they already become formidable. And I realized that it was that spark of transition that I was interested in. It was what is it that allows a group of people to create this successful collective, and what happens and what are the elements behind it? So that was really what I set out to do. And that was, many years ago. I thought I was going to write a column for the journal about this, and I thought it would be, 1,000 words. And it would take me a few weeks. And here we are. It's now 12 years later, and the book is out. So it became a book, and it really became this massive research project that really consumed my life for a long time.
Excellent. And it was about, was it 7 years ago when you first published the piece on the 16 greatest teams in sports history?
No. That was recently. I mean, I started to, the piece never ran that I was going to do for the journal. It never actually ran because, when I started looking into it, I realized this is really hard. I mean, really trying to figure out a way to objectively and empirically decide what the best teams in history are was a huge job. And that was, it really wasn't over. I mean, even as I started to write the book, there were teams that were on the cusp. And then, the All Blacks in 2015, when they won the second World Cup, I mean, suddenly they were in the list, and I had to go back and look at them. So it was a constantly evolving thing as well. But no, it all kind of came together, with the publication of the book.
Yeah. And I guess on that, I mean, you've identified 16 teams in that list, but, as a sports fan myself, I mean, I could probably rattle off 50 odd names in the past 20 years of teams across different leagues, across different countries who've just been unstoppable, whether it was Manchester United team of the late 90s, the Brisbane Lions team of the early 2000s, the Chicago Bulls team of the 90s that won 2 3-peats, and of course none of these have made the list. And I imagine you've copped a lot of flack from people across the globe saying, hey man, what about our team?
I mean, everything you can imagine. No, it's been hard. I mean, the Bulls and I think the New England Patriots in the U.S. I've gotten a ton of grief for that. And, I was just in London, and the lack of an English team on my list of 16 didn't go over that well. But, the thing is, the point of what I was doing wasn't really to end this debate once and for all. I mean, what I wanted to do, I decided to just set some parameters for what I thought a great team had to be. And there were really 8 criteria. Mm-hmm. And what I wanted was to find teams that really met all of those criteria. And there were many of them, but I think the 2 most important ones were, the first was I realized what I was after, which it was longevity. It was finding teams that had a culture of winning that they'd been able to sustain for a long time. So I didn't consider any teams that didn't maintain their dynasty for at least 4 years, and that cut a lot of teams. And then the other thing that the other really tough leader was that the team had to have achieved something inside its sport that had never been done before, and it was absolutely unique. And a lot of teams fail that test, and the Chicago Bulls are a great example. I mean, they won 6 titles in 8 years, but the Boston Celtics of the 50s and 60s won 11 in 13 years. So they didn't beat them there. And then the San Antonio Spurs made the playoffs in 19 consecutive seasons with 5 titles and the greatest long-term winning percentage. So the Bulls didn't match that either. So as great as they were, they didn't meet that final hurdle, which is that they had to have been completely anomalous. I mean, what I wanted was just a sample of teams that were freaks, not necessarily even the greatest teams ever. I mean, you argue that the Bulls would have beaten any of these teams in basketball, but the teams that I selected were absolutely complete outliers. They did things that no one had ever done. And to me, that's how you build a perfect sample to study. I wanted to study these teams that were just unambiguously outstanding. There's no asterisks. There's no questioning their greatness in any way. And that's the sample that I came up with. So there were some very tough cuts. And, all of cricket, wound up being cut because I couldn't decide which cricket team was the greatest team of all time. So, that sport didn't make the final cut. And I've heard a lot about that from the part of the world as well. Sure, but no, the point was really, I just wanted to sample the study to answer the larger question, which is what is it that allowed all of these teams to become great?
Yeah. And I guess On the methodology, I know you've said that it's not about the star player, it's not about the money, the coach, the strategy. Oftentimes, it could be the captain per the name of the book. But I mean, how have you gone about, say, isolating factors such as star player, coaches, money, and so on in your research?
Well, first of all, I did not set out to write a book about leadership or
Mm,
captaincy. I mean, it was not what I imagined the answer would be. And, I assumed it was probably talent first and then second coaching.
mm,
And those were really the two things that I expected to be huge factors. So what I did was I did basically wrote pretty much a biography of all of these 16 teams, not in the book, but I mean, I did enough research to write a book about each one of them. And, what I did was I would pull out, all of these factors and I would look at all the coaches and, I would go back and look intensely at the coaches and their styles and their performance before the streak and after the streak. And in that case, I mean, the results were really shocking. I mean, the coaches of these teams and the managers were, as a group, completely opposite of what I expected. Most of them had very little experience or had bad track records before they came to these amazing teams. They were not supremely accomplished. In fact, the only one who I think was really a legendary coach was Jock McHale from the Collingwood
yeah.
Machine in the 20s. And he is a legitimately amazing coach. And he was the only one. I mean, really every other coach or manager in the group was not up to that level.
Yeah.
And it became very clear that so the one point I want to make very clearly is that, what I discovered about the role of captaincy, I mean, what I found was that all of these teams during the streak had only one thing in common, which was that the streak really fit almost precisely with the career of one player, and that player was always the captain, and in an uncanny way. And the point, I really realized that the captaincy was the main factor, but I want to be clear. All of these things matter. I mean, your coaching matters, talent matters, strategy matters, and so does money. But my point is that the only thing you have to have is a great captain and a certain kind of captain. That's the only thing that all of these teams sustained greatness had. And so, you need many things. Many things come into play to create a great team. But my research, I think, shows very convincingly that the one thing that you have to have, it's like the verb in a sentence. You have to have, in order for it to be a sentence, you have to have a verb, and it's the same with a captain, and a captain of a certain kind. And it wasn't just the 16 teams that I identified. If you go into the second tier and you look at the Bulls and you look at, Brisbane and all the teams you mentioned, you'll see that the same rules apply. I mean, it's something that applies to the vast majority of the great, long-lasting teams that I identified beyond the 16.
Yeah, and something you mentioned there, Sam, was that oftentimes the team's winning streak more or less overlaps with the presence of that captain. And I guess that aligns with what Jim Collins says. I think it's in Built to Last, where he says great companies built around an individual visionary oftentimes fall apart once that person's gone, whether it's the founder or the CEO, because it doesn't empower the rest of the organization to carry the baton once they're gone. Did you notice any instances of these great captains empowering their teammates to carry on the baton? Because it sounds like they're doing everything they can to prop that team up while they're there, but once they're gone, everything just falls apart.
Yeah, no, most of the time there was a real fall off. And I think I saw that over and over again. Some of the teams did okay afterwards. And, one example, a current example, is the San Antonio Spurs, the NBA team in the U.S. Tim Duncan, was the heart and soul of that team. And it was, this incredible streak they've had completely overlaps from his rookie season to the year he retired. Now this year, they were pretty good. I mean, they didn't win, but, again, they were one of the better teams in the NBA. But, in this case, it's really fascinating because I talked to R.C. Buford, who's the general manager of the Spurs, who reached out after I sent him a book, and he said, well, I said, what do you think of leadership? He said, it's our biggest challenge going forward is to try to figure out the leadership. And I said, well, it seems to be going pretty well this season. And he said, well, sure, but Tim Duncan still comes to practice 3 times a week. And he works with the players and he continues to talk to them when they have difficult matchups. And he's still a real presence. So, I was confused by that. But, look, Tim Duncan is still part of the team and he's still participating. I mean, there is something to be said for culture. I think the All Blacks are a great example of that. This is a team that has, I think, developed a culture over the years and that sustains, that sort of paves the way for this kind of leadership that I'm talking about. And I think they've had an abundance of these leaders, and that's why I wound up picking 2 All Blacks teams in the 16, the Buck Shelford team from the late 1980s and Richie McCaw's more recent team. But there have been others as well. And I think that, culture does have something to do with this, but my sense is that the culture only matters as much as it creates the right conditions for this kind of leadership this kind of leader to be picked. And the thing about it is these aren't the leaders we expect. I mean, these captains are not, by any means, were not the kinds of leaders that I would have imagined.
Yeah, so let's explore that a little bit further. When you say they're not the kinds of leaders we would have imagined, what do you mean?
I mean, not at all. I mean, I just was shocked because, first of all, I didn't know who some of them were, and I'd never heard of them. And I mean, Barcelona is a great example because, I mean, I knew about Messi and Iniesta and Pep Guardiola, the manager. I mean, I knew all of that, but I didn't know much about Carlos Puyol at all. And I really was surprised that he was the kind of least talented, least glamorous member of that team. And I mean, he was kind of a barbarian out there who would just slobber around the field. And it was completely opposite of the rest of the team, which played this hypnotic form of football that was so impossible to penetrate. But he was the center of that team. And, one of the ones in the U.S. which was a real revelation to me was, this women's soccer team that won the World Cup in 1999. And, they were a big deal in the U.S. and they have these very famous stars, Mia Hamm and Julie Foudy and, these really telegenic stars who came out of that team. The captain was this woman named Carla Overbeck, who I'd never heard of. I didn't remember her at all. And, the more I looked into her, I realized that wasn't an accident. All of these captains, to my great surprise, really did not like individual attention. They didn't want personal accolades. They weren't in it for their own advancement. And she was a great example because she, on the long flights that team took overseas, they'd be dragging, and she would get off the plane and get off the bus, and she would carry everyone's luggage to their rooms for them. She was like a servant of the team. It was servant leadership in the extreme. And after they won the World Cup, most of the team went to New York, and they had this giant pep rally in Times Square, and it was this big deal. She wasn't there because she'd flown home and didn't want no part of it. And I asked her what she'd done that day, and she said she'd done 3 loads of laundry.
Oh, wow. Wow.
She wanted nothing to do with it. And that was one of the things. So that was part of it. They weren't stars. They were mostly role players. They were support players. They played defense or they played unglamorous positions. And they carried water for the team. And they didn't want individual accolades. And those were the 2 of the biggest prizes, but there were many, many more things about them that were just unusual.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I guess I'm looking to draw sort of parallels between sports teams and the corporate world. I mean, we see companies like Netflix, their founder, Reed Hastings, has basically published a 100-plus page culture deck, which clearly states that Netflix, the company, is a sports team, not a family, because they're collectively working towards a greater mission, which is all about entertaining people around the world. And if you don't perform, there's no place for you. Whereas in a family, there's unconditional love. It's not like, hey, you don't perform, you're no longer my son. I mean, hey, that might happen in some families, but generally, it's not the case. So do you have any thoughts on whether a sports team makes a good reference point for, say, a startup or a large organization insofar as it relates to the topic of leadership?
No, I think there are a lot of parallels, and I wrote about some of them in the book. I think the biggest thing that I noticed about these captains was something that I think is interesting. There are two things. There are two parallel forces that are going on both in sports and I think in the business world. And in sports, because there's so much money pouring in and it's TV money, I think there's more of an emphasis now on superstars and famous managers and marketable, bankable players. And, I see a lot of teams where leadership is really a combination of the manager and the star. And the stars are often just made the captain, by default. And what I've found, the same thing is happening, I think, in business to some extent. I think, a lot of the cues that we're all taking in the business world are from startup culture. And I think we're looking at those models, and I think startup culture is similar. I think the idea is that there should be flatter hierarchies, and there should be much more direct communication from the founders with the star talent, and fewer layers of middle management. But what I found on these teams that sustained their dominance for a long time was that the captains were middle managers, classic middle managers. They stood between the players and the stars and everyone else and the coach and management. And, what was fascinating about them is they were middle managers, but they were fiercely independent, and they were not afraid to express dissent or to create conflict inside the team. If there was something going on they didn't like, they were really hard to manage, but that independence was crucial. And I saw it time and again in tough situations where the team was really about to lose. They were about to drop. Their dynasty was about to end. They were really in tough times. And that's when the qualities and leadership qualities of these people really emerged. And that's something we forget. I think we look at startup culture. You mentioned Netflix, which is a company that's been on an incredible growth curve and has a ton of venture backing and investment. And this is it's just a story of success upon success. And I think when we take our cues from that sort of experience, we're forgetting that the most important factor in a team or a company that endures and continues to succeed over the long time is that they weather those tough moments. And in those tough moments, that's when I believe you need strong middle management. You need people in the middle who are more concerned with the company or the team's goals than they are with their own, and who are willing to take unpopular stands and difficult positions and to create controversy and stir up dissent and argument. That's really when you need these kinds of characters, and I think we forget that. I think they're being squeezed out both in sports and oftentimes in corporate hierarchy.
Yeah, and on dissent, it's funny you should mention that. It aligns perfectly with what I was listening to this morning on another podcast, which was all about Ed Catmull from Pixar.
Yes.
Pixar's been very, very big on what they call the brain trust, where creatives, senior managers, people lower down the food chain from the organization come together, and they're basically invited to provide feedback with no fear of recourse about a movie. If they think a movie or a part of a movie out and out sucks, they will say so. And without that feedback loop, they won't be able to, get the learnings they need to make the changes they need to make those movies as good as they are. And I know in your book you've touched on the topic of dissent, which is one of the 7 core qualities you've identified in these captains. And you tell the story of the Soviet Red Army hockey team.
Right. No, that's my favorite dissent story. So everyone remembers, the Soviet team was terrific, but what most people remember, especially in this country, is 1980 in Lake Placid, and they lost to the Americans, and they lost to not only Americans, they lost to a bunch of American college players, who had no business beating them. And this was a massive humiliation for this team, and the height of the Cold War. So after that there's a story that I'd never heard and had never really been told, which kind of emerged in my research about that team. So after Lake Placid, the coach of this team, Victor Tikhonov, who was a kind of a taskmaster, had recently taken over the team. He told them all in the meeting, he said, listen, they were all worried about what was going to happen to them when they got back to Moscow. And he said, look, the story we're going to tell is that we lost as a team. We all share the blame equally for what happened. So that was the line. And, you know, they get on the plane and they're flying back to Moscow, somewhere over the Atlantic. And Tikhonov is up in the first class cabin of this plane. He's talking to his assistants and he's saying, he's just letting loose. He's saying, you know, he's pointing at specific players who he thought failed, and he was saying some of them needed to go. I mean, it was completely opposite of what he had told the team. He was really blaming it on several people. What he didn't know was that this veteran defenseman on the team, whose name was Valery Vasilyev, could hear every word he was saying and overheard the whole thing. And Vasilyev just lost it. So you got to imagine this scene. So here's Tikhonov with his assistants, and in the first class cabin, there are a bunch of Soviet officials, Politburo people. I mean, big time, you know, Soviet officials on this flight. Vasilyev comes barreling over and grabs Tikhonov by the throat, and he starts shaking him, and he threatens to throw him off the airplane if he doesn't take it back. And this is crazy. I mean, this is a one-way ticket to Siberia, you know, doing something like this. So, you know, he was hauled back to the cabin and you know, it kind of, he cooled off and he wasn't sent to Siberia. In fact, several months later, when Tikhonov did get rid of the captain at the time, his teammates were asked to vote, and they elected him as the new captain. And Vasilyev and Tikhonov and the Kremlin let the decision stand, which was incredible to me. I just couldn't believe that in the Soviet Union of all places this would happen. But what I found out in talking to his teammates about this was that immediately after this happened, Vasilyev never mentioned it again, never said a word about it publicly. And, you know, he came to practice and he continued to talk to his coach and to work with the players and to do his job. And so I started looking into conflict because I couldn't understand this what was really happening here. And I found some studies that are really fascinating that separate conflict inside a group into several different kinds. And there's one kind that they call personal conflict, which is, you know, an argument between people that's really stems from dislike. It's a personal animosity. And then there's another kind which they call task conflict. And this is an argument or dissent inside a group that's really aimed at the larger task at hand and making sure that the unit stays and does the best that it can collectively. And what I realized was that what Vasilyev did, as crazy as it looks, was not personal. It wasn't a personal attack on his coach. It was about trying to keep the team unified in a difficult moment. And he was really acting in the team's best interest, and it wasn't driven by his personal hatred for his coach. And when I saw that, it all made sense, because all of these athletes and all of these captains at some time did something like this, which just seemed like the kind of toxic behavior that destroys team chemistry. But it always had the reverse effect. It always made the team better. And what I realized was that when they did this, they made clear that they weren't attacking anyone on a personal level. They were really the conflict was about the task at hand. It was about making sure that the team was playing and competing the best they could. And that was a huge revelation to me that you know, we look at conflict inside teams in sports. Most executives will try to get rid of people who create conflict. They're troublemakers. They're clubhouse cancers. They're toxic, and they'll get rid of them. But the truth is that some kinds of conflict are essential, and task conflict is essential and important, and sustaining excellence over a long time. But I think a lot of times the public looks at this, or people running teams look at this, and they see all conflict as being the same, whether it's personal or not.
Yeah. Well, it's like what they say about diamonds, right? It's going to take a fair bit of friction to create a diamond, and it's the same thing with building startups. Oftentimes, startups go through countless failures to learn what they need to learn in order to break through. And every overnight success story was actually 5 years in the making. So there's quite a bit of conflict that goes into it. And I guess we've touched on a few of the 7 core qualities you've identified, but I guess on dissent, it kind of flies in the face of one of the other core qualities you've identified, which is they possess remarkable emotional self-control. So when I'm thinking of Vasiliev running over and grabbing his coach by the throat, I'm not exactly thinking remarkable emotional self-control.
No, I mean, you're right. And, they would do things that could seem unhinged at times. And they did. And, one of the things that was really remarkable about them was how much they broke the rules. I mean, they were, again, there was a kind of a twist to the way they did it. But I was really surprised over and over again that they did unsportsmanlike things in competition. And, it was really a pattern that didn't make any sense to me. My favorite example was this Cuban women's volleyball team in the 1990s. And the captain, Maria Luis, when they were again about to lose, they were really struggling at the 96 Olympics. And, she came up with this strategy against Brazil where Brazil was kind of their big rival and they were really worried about losing. And she came up with this strategy where she told her teammates to insult the Brazilians and just hurl vicious insults at them across the net, which no one had ever done in volleyball. Yeah. It was never done. But the strategy, really worked. I mean, it got into the Brazilians' heads, and by the 5th set, they were making mistakes and they were frustrated, and the Cubans wound up winning. And the teams got into a big brawl afterwards, and it was a mess. And it just was surprising to me that they did these things. But the difference again was the motivation, and these were tactical decisions. These were things that they did that were strategically designed to help the team. They weren't things they did in the heat of emotion. This wasn't Zidane, headbutting Materazzi in the World Cup final. That was an act of impulse and rage. And these were tactical things. These were cold-blooded things they thought they needed to do. And the thing is that it wasn't about sportsmanship as much as it was about doing whatever they thought was necessary to help the team win, and assuming they could get away with it. I mean, they kind of made a study of trying to read the referees and figure out what they could get away with, and they had a very sophisticated sense of what they were able to, what would help the team without was likely to help the team without creating big problems. And so I think that's a little bit separate from emotional control. I think the way they behaved in competition seemed unhinged, and many of them seemed to be out of control, but they were really tactical decisions. The emotional control I'm talking about is slightly different. It was the ability to overcome serious personal obstacles and personal emotions, and to keep those things in check, and to not just to continue to play, but to play at a very high level. And there were so many examples of this. My favorite one, though, was this is the French national handball team, which was the class of the world for many years and the greatest handball team ever by a long stretch. And their captain, Jerome Fernandez, he had just become captain, and this was in the 2009 World Championships. And they made it to the finals, and they were playing Croatia, and they were not expected to win that match. It was in Croatia, and it was a real test for them. No one really thought that they would ever be a dominant team at that point. But so he got a call from his mother, and this is 2 days before the final. Yeah. And she told him that his father was in the hospital and was dying of cancer. I mean, he only had a few days to live. And they had not told him about this because they didn't want him to be distracted during the tournament. But now they had no choice. And so Fernandez faced this is a wrenching decision. I mean, because he had to decide whether to stay and play or not to play. If he stayed and they lost and his father died, and you can imagine how he would have felt. So not only did he decide to stay and play, but he also did something else which was remarkable, which he didn't tell any of his teammates what was going on. So nobody knew what was going on. He didn't want to distract them. He didn't want it to affect the way they played. And he not only played a brilliant game, he scored the clinching goal in the final minute to win. And after the game, he sort of collapsed on the court, started sobbing, and none of his teammates had any idea what was going on. And he wound up making it back to see his father before he died. But this was the moment, really, and his teammates attest to this, that they realized that he was a collective captain, that he was someone who would sacrifice everything for the team, and that it wasn't, he wasn't factoring in his own personal emotions and issues. Yeah. He wasn't putting them ahead of the team, and like time and again, these captains showed this incredible fortitude to put aside their own issues and problems and emotions for the better of the team. And that was really remarkable. And they what was remarkable about it was that they did aggressive and seemingly unhinged things in competition. It wasn't that they didn't have emotion or express it. It was just when they did it, it was tactical and it was aimed at helping the team win. And they never used emotion in a way that might hurt the team's chances.
Yeah,
and that was surprising.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, the more you talk about this topic and the 7 core qualities, the more I see parallels between sports teams and business teams. Like a number of things you've touched on there, Sam. One was captains who are willing to break the rules, and things like reading the referee and seeing how much you can get away with. Immediately, I think of companies like Airbnb and Uber who just set up shop in a new country, and regardless of what the regulation says, they'll just get going, and eventually the regulator may say, hey, you guys need to start paying tax, or you need to get a taxi license, or whatever it is, and they'll push back and push back and push back until so many consumers are using that service that the regulators almost rendered powerless, because if they were to outlaw that company, then the people will push back. And that's what's happening in a lot of countries with those organizations. And then when you talk about the topic of emotional intelligence and not letting emotion dictate your decision making, I mean, today mindfulness training is so big in large organizations, and I mean, startups are getting into it as well, and there's countless podcasts out there on mindfulness and meditation apps and all that type of stuff that, I mean, it just seems like there is a lot to learn by dissecting sports teams and taking some of those lessons and applying them to the corporate world.
No, I really see the parallels. I mean, I think about my own career, and I've been a manager. I've had a lot of bosses, and as I did this research, I started to reassess. And I think a lot of people who read the book have said the same thing, which is that it kind of makes you reassess the teams that you've been a part of and how they were led. And I think of teams that I really enjoyed being a part of that weren't very successful, and then teams that were very successful that weren't necessarily a picnic. And but you also look at bosses differently. I mean, I think one of the best things that I learned that I think applies the most precisely to teams and business is communication. And you tipped to it earlier. One of the astonishing things about these captains were that they weren't charismatic. They weren't great orators. They never gave speeches. Most of them never did it and didn't believe in doing it. They didn't believe in this idea of trying to motivate through the big speech. And, so I didn't understand how someone like Tim Duncan is a great example. Yeah. So Yogi Berra, the people who have, are known for being inarticulate or lacking that sort of emotion and charisma that we associate with leadership. And a lot of these captains were like that. And I couldn't understand how they led. But what I realized in studying Duncan and Berra was that they had a very consistent way of communicating with their teammates. And they weren't interested in speeches, but they had another method, which is that they circulated very widely among the team. They felt comfortable talking to everybody, and they would talk to individuals very intensely in short bursts, and they listened as much as they talked. But they also used body language. They would stare. Tim Duncan would stare at his teammates almost uncomfortably for 3 seconds at a time, like directly into their eyes while he was making a point. And it was that democratic style. It was very low key. And it was always behind the scenes. It was constant, though. I mean, they talked a lot inside the context of the team, even if they didn't say much, in front of the TV cameras or publicly. But that style, I found a great bit of research that's been done at MIT, which really backs this up. And they looked at teams and competition, and they had these digital recorders that everyone would wear, and they would measure the speech patterns and who talked to whom for how long, and they would record all this information. And the thing that they learned was that communication was not only the most had the biggest correlation to a team's performance, but they found that the best teams had this talkative culture where everyone kind of spoke and felt comfortable speaking, and everyone spoke for about the same amount of time. Mm-hmm. But on all these teams, there was one figure, and they called it the charismatic connector. And this was someone who did exactly what Tim Duncan did. I mean, he circulated widely and talking to everyone intensely in short bursts, and it was the exact same pattern. And they said all the teams that were most effective and the best performers didn't necessarily have the most skill or the best talent, but they all had that same talkative, democratic form of communication, which was really built and nurtured by one person, and a person who isn't the person you would think. I mean, I think when we look at a group interacting, if we're trying to evaluate who the leader is, we look at the person who speaks up and gives the speech and, tries to set a tone. I think too often we consider that to be a mark of a leader. But what this research showed, and what my experience in the study of captains showed, is not the case. I mean, a lot of Tim Duncan's teammates said that if you walked into the practice and you watched everyone individually, you would never suspect that he was the leader of the team. It just wasn't. But if you watched the way that he circulated and talked to everyone, knowing what we know about communication patterns, then I think you could recognize him pretty quickly.
Yeah. Well, I guess there's a lesson in there for recruitment managers out there. Don't necessarily hire manager roles based on someone being super charismatic in an interview. There may be a lot of underlying qualities that go into it.
Yeah, no, that's the number one thing I would say to hiring managers. I think, it's not the person, if you're looking for a team lead, it's not the person who blows you away in an interview. In fact, I would recommend trying a test, which is, look at their background and look at a team they were on that did something great and say, well, you must have been a great leader. You must have really pulled that team through. You must have real great leadership qualities. And the correct answer, if you've got a really good leader, is that they'll deflect the credit immediately. They won't take it. I mean, they'll lay it off on their teammates and say, no, I mean, everyone was great and they all did their jobs, and it wasn't me. It was, and I think too often that's seen as a sign of weakness, but really I think it's a sign of strength. And I'd say the other thing is that this is a difficult breed of person to identify, because I don't think there's anything in an interview that you can find or hear or see that will convince you that that person is the right kind of leader. I mean, what you really need to do is to watch them interact in a group environment. And I mean, there's some way to do that, or you can really lean on their references to find out. And I think you'll really be able to tell, because, the thing about all these 7 traits that was really surprising to me is talent and charisma were not on the list. They're not important. I mean, they're important. It's great if someone has them, but they're absolutely not, they're not standard equipment on these great leaders. I think these 7 characteristics are really all matter of behavior. And, leadership is really about the choices that people make day in and day out, hour to hour, minute to minute. And that they're constantly leading, and it's something that they do all the time, and they never stop. And that's not something that, that we're conditioned to look for.
Yeah. And on, conditioned to do it day in, day out. And again, I guess that comes back to the emotional intelligence as well, where if you're building a startup, or if you've taken over a huge $500 million budget business unit at a large company, and I suppose there's strong winds ahead, that charismatic leader, when push comes to shove and when the going gets tough, may often find that charisma kind of goes poof into midair. Whereas the leader with the qualities that you've mentioned will say, okay, we're going to go through some turbulence ahead, but they'll be able to steer the ship towards Shaw, whereas someone who's just going on charisma alone and energy and that type of thing may not have what it takes in those turbulent times.
No, that's exactly right. The funny thing that I saw time and again was that it's those moments when you need leadership. And I think that's one of the mirages that we are dealing with startup culture, because I think we look at a lot of these companies that have been, just on long upward trajectories, and we forget that, the minute you hit turbulence, that's when you need that middle layer of managers. And the thing that is interesting, and this was something that I mentioned Carla Overbeck earlier, and this is something one of her coaches said about her, and he mentioned the thing about her carrying the luggage for her teammates, and he said, the reason she did that, and the reason that she stayed out of the spotlight, and the reason that she, was a very unselfish player who would immediately lay the ball off to another teammate. She never made long runs or tried to score and any of that on defense. He said the reason she did those things was that because it gave her a sort of currency, in that her teammates knew that she wasn't in it for her own personal advancement, and that she was dedicated to the team, so that when things got tough, she could really push her teammates, and the teammates didn't resent it. They knew where it was coming from. They knew that it was coming from a genuine place, and that to me is the thing that gets forgotten. I think we model ourselves after companies that have been, on an upward trajectory and have never gone through tough times, and I think we forget that it's those moments where you need those people who've been saving up that currency, who've been staying in the shadows, letting other people shine, not making spectacles of themselves, serving the team constantly. And those are the people that we turn to in those tough moments, because we know that whatever they're doing, they're not thinking about saving their own bacon, or how they're gonna where they're gonna get transferred, or what they're gonna do next. Whatever they're doing is motivated 100% by trying to help the team improve and get out of the hole that it's in. And that's the quality. That's really what leadership is. I mean, anyone can have a grand vision, and anyone can send on a great idea and get a lot of momentum from it. But I think my book is really about sustaining success. It's about creating a culture that can endure over time and can do something that's never been done. And that's what I'm talking about. And that's, if you want to do that, you have to have that strong middle layer of humble, team-focused, tough, irascible, dissenting managers who are going to stand up and who are not going to shrink from the fight. And I think it's those people who carry you through and allow you to achieve that longevity.
Definitely. Well, you've left our audience with a hell of a lot of great takeaways, Sam. But before we wrap up with our session, I can't let you go without throwing you into our 3-question lightning round. Are you ready to rock and roll, my man?
I'm ready. Do it.
I've actually customized these questions given the sporting nature of today's episode. So the first question is, if you could play for any team at any stage of the 20th century or 21st century for that matter, who would it be and why?
I would play for Barcelona from 2008 to 2013. I think they were magical. And, the fact that they achieved something that no other club soccer team has ever done in an era when it was very hard to do so, and when other teams were really loading up on talent. But, I think the thing about that team, it's general humility and how much fun they had together and how closely knit they were. It was really something special.
Yeah.
I think that would be my first choice. I think my second choice, I hate to say it, but it might be the All Blacks from the late 90s. Buck Shelford is such an incredible figure. I would have loved to have played.
Yeah, it's completely okay. You can say that on an Australian podcast. It's fine. We'll just edit that out later.
Okay, good.
So the second question is, if you could ask any sporting personality a question, and given that you're a sports journalist, you probably can do that, but let's go back to, say, the mid-20th century. So let's think people who you can't actually ask a question today in many cases. Who would it be and what would you ask?
Such a great question. I think I would probably go back to this great Hungarian team. from the 50s, the Hungarian soccer team,
yeah.
and Ferenc Puskás, who was their captain, who was a fascinating character. And there's the relationship between him and his head coach, who was this guy Gustav Sebisch, was fascinating. And there's this story that I never was able to completely verify, that Puskás, Sebisch would draw these diagrams on the chalkboard, like, we need to do this and do that. He was a very tactically minded guy, and they would come out of the tunnel, and Puskás would sort of look at his teammates and would say, "Listen, forget everything he just said. Let's just go out and play the way we always." So I'd love to ask him. About how he viewed tactics and how he managed the game on the field. I think that would be. I'd love to hear him talk about that.
Yeah, fantastic. I think he also had a brief coaching stint, Ferenc Puskás, back in the 90s, I think, in the Australian soccer league back then, or the National Soccer League as it was known, but many, many moons ago. But definitely a great team back in the 50s, and I guess Hungary is one national soccer team or national football team who I suppose hasn't been able to recreate that success as more and more money has been thrown into competitive sports.
Yeah, no, they really fell right off the map the minute that Puskás left.
Okay, well, lucky last, Sam, is...
All right.
Let's do this. It's all about rituals and routines. You've released a couple of books. You're a Wall Street Journal sports journalist, doing all sorts of awesome stuff, flying around the world, taking holidays in Italy, all that good stuff. How do you stay on top of your game? Do you have any daily rituals or routines, much like a professional athlete might have?
I do. I ride my bike to work through Manhattan on 6th Avenue, and I weaponize my commute. I mean, I go as hard as I can, as fast as I can. I try not to run into taxis. I try not to hit anybody. I have a helmet. I am fully armored. But no, that really keeps me going. I mean, it's a little bit of adrenaline. It's a little bit of danger. It's a little bit of like extreme exercise in the morning, and I ride home at night as well most nights, and so that really wakes me up. It keeps me alive. It gets the blood flowing. It sets me up really well for my day. I just I'm probably lucky to be alive.
Yeah, I was going to say, riding in Manhattan, surely the traffic's not all that receptive of bicyclists.
No, but I think it's good. I think you need to take some risks and feel alive, and I think it helps keep me settled.
Fantastic. Love it. Okay, well, our audience can pick up a copy of The Captain Class and your previous book, Fantasyland, all about winning America's largest baseball fantasy competition on Amazon. They can hit you up on Twitter at Sam Walkers. That's with an S at the end. They can check you out on your website at buysamwalker.com. Obviously, they can read your articles at wsjsports.com. And there's an article called The 7 Leadership Secrets of Great Team Captains, which delves a little bit deeper into the topics we've covered today. Is there anything else they should check out, Sam?
No, I think that'll do. And there's been a lot of press, and they can read some of the reviews and see what people have been saying about the book, and I hope that will entice them to buy.
Fantastic. Love it. Well, we'll do our best to promote the book for you on this side of the world, Sam. You've done an awesome job. It's 11:30 p.m. over in New York, so I think, look, I'm not going to tell you to go to bed, but I think you should. So have a great night. You've been an awesome guest.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you.
Hey guys, it's Steve again. If you're picking up what we're putting down, we'd love it if you took just a minute of your time to like, share, or subscribe to Future Squared on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher. It would mean a hell of a lot to the team here who work effortlessly to bring you thought leaders and experts on topics of corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement on a weekly basis. As always, you can find more resources on innovation, including blogs, books, podcasts, videos, webinars, and tools at www.collectivecamp.us. If you'd like to connect with me on Twitter, you can do so at Steve Glaveski. That's Glaveski. Until next time, keep innovating. Future Squared out.